and on. Oh, wait. All right. Oh, beautiful. Hi. So just behind there are all the mats and everything. So just find a spot where you want to be, and then you can grab your staff. Beautiful. And Amanda, do you want us to do as if we don't know that you're here? Do you want us to like not look at the camera, right? Just yeah. Okay. Yeah. Like no one knows that you're here. Yes. All right. So first of all, welcome everyone to today's workshop, which is the last one, the number 4 in the series of 4 on what we've chosen to call yoga psychology. All right, and it's the one that is focused on the heart chakra, which is also called Anahata chakra, and we've decided, or well, I actually decided to call it healing the emotional body, grieving the original wound. And so I just want to say as well that it's really nice to see that so many found that intriguing and wanted to come. I think I have to have a look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Yeah, I think it's the one where I have the most people compared to the other 3. So that's just really nice because it also means that we can all really relate to that when it comes to the idea of wounding and love and emotions and things like that. I mean, obviously it's very natural, but I think that not for everyone it's natural to feel that we can relate to it. And that's a little bit what the whole thing about the heart chakra and the wound is about, actually, the fact that we cannot maybe relate to that idea. So, some of you have been to the 3 other ones. Some of you have been to 2 of the other ones, and some of you were here yesterday. But some of you were not here at any of them. So I'm going to start with the same introduction that I've done for the other 3 as well. All right? And anyway, for those of you who've been to the other ones, it's always nice to have that kind of reminder. And it's a way to also see the logic in the following of it. So I'm just going to go into it, and just so you know, I've got my notes here that I'll probably not stick to, but I will now and then look into it and see if I remembered everything or if I need to. So that's why I'm like sometimes looking at, I'm not on Facebook. Okay, so my name is Charlotte Skogsberg, and I am from Sweden originally. I've been living here in Bali for almost 5 years now, and I teach yoga. I teach yoga here at Samadhi. And I also have a background in clinical psychology and psychoanalysis. And I think that's probably the reason that I am so interested in working on this connection between the Western view that we would call simple psychology, or psychotherapy, or psychoanalysis, and all those things that start with PSY, and linking that to an Eastern view, which is much more philosophical in a certain way, and that we can call yoga, for instance, or other types of Eastern philosophies. And as I mentioned yesterday, actually the yoga psychology name in itself is something that exists already in the yogic philosophy, and I think originally it was just called yoga and not yoga psychology. And we would, for instance, have a look into the holy book of modern yoga, that would be the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And the whole book is really a description of how to master the fluctuations of the mind, basically. And so that is really, in a certain way, what yoga psychology is. Because actually yoga is meditation and movement. And meditation in itself is a way to, if you will, befriend the mind. We can say master the mind or so, but without having that kind of conflict that sounds like when I say that, it's a way to befriend the mind, let's say. Because the mind is a wonderful tool, but it can be your friend or it can be your foe. And actually most of us, it's our biggest enemy because it's a life full of struggle between the mind and the heart in a certain way. So the yogic philosophy explains how we function through the subtle body or the pranic body or the energy body, or we can even then say the chakra system. And chakra in itself, the word means vortex or whirlpool, and it's represented by a circle, if you will, because of the name. And depending on the school, they would have a 7, 8, or hundreds of chakras. And in a certain way, we can say that there are hundreds because there's plenty of small ones as well. But we usually focus on the 7 main ones that are situated along the spine when we talk about the chakra system. All right, and so the pranic body is then basically life force or energy. And in a way to just make this really kind of hands-on, easy. Hello, come on in. You've got mats and everything just behind me here. So just find a spot and take a mat and some blocks and a bolster, for instance. Welcome in. And when I then talk about life force or energy, to make it really hands-on and easy, it's basically what makes you feel alive. And so, as I said, for instance, yesterday, when we have a really good hygiene, basically, of ourselves, and we sleep well, we have a good routine, we eat right foods that we can easily digest, and then our combustion system in the body and the third chakra can transform that into energy well. We also can then move around, make ourselves detox, and therefore also strengthen our muscles. And so we just feel really good when we're in that, and we can even say that our energy is high. And on the contrary to that, when we go through moments in life that we've all had, for instance, let's say that we're out of whack, we're traveling or something, maybe we're not sleeping well, and therefore we feel tired. And when we feel tired, we have a tendency to eat things that give us a quick energy boost, like fatty or sugary things, for instance, but then we find it hard to digest that. And so when we find it hard to digest that, it makes us even more tired, and then we start to develop fat, basically, just to make it simple in that way. And we can even say it in those times how that makes us feel like our energy is low. So if you can just go into the idea that when I talk about the life force or pranic body, I'm talking about that feeling that you make you feel alive. And that can also then explain a little bit, then we start to talk about what the chakras are. So the chakras then are these vortexes that allow for the energy to flow freely in the body. And if everything works well, and if they're open and they flow freely, you can also feel yourself strong, and you can feel each part of the body very well. Now, one of the typical, let's say, symptoms of blocked chakras can be the fact of not actually feeling the body. And a typical thing, for instance, is when it comes to our hips and the blockages that we find in the pelvic area that links straight down to the rest of the body, actually, when we feel tightness. And it can feel so tight that it feels numb, and we can't actually even feel it. And especially when we begin to move around, and people tell us to do this and that and feel this and that in the body, and we don't really know what they mean because we can't feel that. Yeah, that's a very typical kind of illustration of what would be called a blocked chakra. And if I would then take this into a more Western view that can be more easily to relate to for everyone here, maybe, it is also very much what we would today explain as the different systems of the body on a biological level. Starting with the one system that controls all the rest, which is the nervous system. And the nervous system has its central part in the central nervous system, which is situated in the brain. And therefore, this is the main part for a lot of us, and well, for all of us. And then we have the vagus nerve that actually starts in the brain and goes all the way down towards the tailbone, following the spine, which is a very thick and the biggest nerve that we have in the body. Now, most people have never even heard of vagus nerve. So if you find that that's a new word for you, you're not alone. And then we have the periphery, which is basically all the nerve endings that comes from the highway, if you will, of the nervous system and goes out into the rest of the body. And this is what basically then in the yogic perspective was explained as our, well, Sushumna, which is the main nerve ending or channel, energy channel that goes along the spine. And then the nadis, 72,000 to be exact, apparently, that goes out in the body, which is then basically the periphery of the nervous system. All right? So where does the idea of the chakras come in when we talk about the biology that we see in the Western view or the medicine today? Well, the central nervous system, or the nervous system in itself, controls all the other systems, and that means blood circulation, the skeleton, digestion, and such. And within them, there's also what we call the endocrine system, which is the hormonal system that's constituted by our glands, and our glands that secrete hormones. Now, what's interesting is that where we have glands is more or less where actually the yogis then place the chakras in the body. All right? And so, in the same way that you can imagine then that then in explaining the chakras as these vortexes that distribute the energy when they function properly, well, a gland distribute or secrete hormones when they function properly. And you might or might not have heard of one of the typical deficiencies in glands is when they talk about the thyroid gland, which is situated in the throat, or the fifth chakra for the chakra system. That can be hyper or hypo, which is a very common illness in today's world. And that means that it's either underproductive, basically blocked, or excessive, overproductive. And that has an effect on the hormones, of course, and then very much, especially this one, on the body shape that can go into increasing enormously. You can't really do anything about it, or even doing the opposite to it. Okay? So basically, just as a very modern view on the physical body, the fact of having healthy and well-functioning glands is essential for our health and for our well-being. Obviously, the hormones have an impact on us physically, but also very much, of course, emotionally. And so, when we start to look into the chakra system and each and one of these chakras and association with the glands, we can also understand, and it's amazing really, how all the characteristics that would be explained throughout the chakra system and each chakra is very much linked to all the characteristics emotionally, physically, and life-wise of the evolution of the glands and the parts of the body. So, just as a reminder for those who already know, or for a quick explanation for those of you who have never heard of this before, the 7 chakras are situated then along the spine, just a little bit in front of it. It's not on the spine, but just a little bit in front of it. And it starts all the way down basically by your pelvic muscle, your root, with the root chakra, or called Muladhara. You don't have to remember this. And then the second chakra is just a little bit above. It's about 3 inches, they say. Also nothing that you have to register as information. In the pelvic bowl, quite deep down in the pelvic bowl. And that one is called Svadhisthana. It's our sacral chakra and linked to our gonads, or the reproductive organs. So therefore, the hormones that are our sexual hormones. And that explains very much when we start to talk a little bit about what the second chakra has for characteristics. I'll get back to that. Third chakra is situated just above the navel, but underneath the rib cage, and is also therefore called the navel chakra, or Manipura. It's the sense of I, it's our powerhouse. It's represented by fire, for instance, for the elements, and it can be easily imagined that that would be the case, since it's situated then where we have our gastric system, basically, and the acidity that I'm sure that at least once in your life you've experienced when you have like a acid reflux from the belly, for instance, and you can understand why they would link that to fire, because it's a quite burning sensation. And also, of course, the capacity of your gastric or digestive system to burn the food that you're eating and transform it into energy will depend on how well functioning the third chakra then is. Now, the fourth chakra is then situated in the rib cage, or in the heart center. And so therefore we talk about the heart chakra. And the name for it is Anahata, which does not mean heart. It means unstruck. And it will become more clear to you why when we then focus on that today. All right? The fifth chakra is then, as I said earlier on, situated in the throat, Vishuddhi, and it's linked to then oral expression, and therefore actually also creativity. So it has a direct link actually with the second chakra. Anyway, the sixth chakra is situated here. So it's the most famous one probably, because it's the one that we all know as the third eye center, situated basically in between our eyebrows. it's called Anya, and it is linked to the pineal gland. And then we have the seventh one, Sahasrara, or the crown chakra, which is situated, well, some say just here, but some say even that it's a little bit above. I don't know. They would link it to the pituitary gland. So now you just have the image of the chakra system, all right? And just to give a really brief explanation of the three first one before we tap into the fourth, where we are focusing on today, just to see kind of the logic in it. One thing as well that I just wanted to say, with our very Western view on things, we could have a tendency to look into the issues of each one of the chakras and go, oh, this is where I need to focus on, and that is what I need to focus on, or I haven't dealt with this one properly, so I will not be able to access the next one. In our very structured way of seeing things, that could make sense, but actually it's all very much intertwined, and we very much work on all of it at once. And I was mentioning on the very first day how the idea that in our root chakra we start to develop a relationship to safety and security, and therefore the demon of it, what comes in and makes it hard for us, is fear. It's actually what we will find in each and one of the chakras, of course, but fear transformed into a feeling state. And so, of course, the way we are dealing with fear and safety and security in itself, in its very original form, will have an impact in how we deal with it when it comes to guilt and shame and grief anyway. Does that make sense? Yeah. So if we are someone who feels very safe in the world, it will obviously make it easier for us to work on the other things, but it also means that we will still have developed issues with this, because we live in a world today which is not at all our natural habitat. I mentioned this yesterday, and it's even more important when I talk about the heart chakra. Our natural habitat is obviously living out in nature. And there's even such a thing called chromotherapy, which is color therapy, which means that if we look at different colors, and especially if we do this as a regular practice and we do it long enough, it will have an effect on us on a mental and emotional and therefore also physical level. And there's two colors that has a very strong impact on us to calm us down, and that's blue and green. And that's perfectly natural if you think about what nature actually looks like. Basically, anywhere in the world, we will find quite a lot of the color green and blue when we're out in nature. Well, maybe in desert, there will be less of the green, but I think that you see what I'm going with this. And so, of course, when we live in an environment where most things are gray instead, we're quite disconnected to what our natural habitat is. And all along of this, the way that society since generations and generations have been structured, this just means that we've come further and further away from something that is actually really authentic to us. And I think that is really important to remember as we talk about the heart chakra. All right. First chakra is a relationship to feeling safe, because we develop it in our first year and we're very helpless in our first year. So depending on how well our needs are being met, we will develop a vision of the world as a very safe place, or maybe not so safe. Then once we've started to become actually quite secure in ourselves, we begin to develop a desire to explore. And so we begin to move. This is when we then begin to walk. We begin to move our pelvis, for instance, and we start to use our senses. So we feel, we touch, we smell, we taste everything around us. And you know this because you can see in a small child that starts to explore, that puts everything in their mouth, and we're testing everything, right? And everything is exciting as well. Even our feces are exciting because we don't feel ashamed for them, that we then learn later on that we should be. So once we come up to that, then we start to develop a little bit more of a personality. I was mentioning yesterday, we come into the age between 3 and 5, and the famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud developed the concept of the Oedipus complex, which relates to the myth of Oedipus, who married his mother and killed his father, to make it short. And this basically just means that we start to integrate the difference between gender and generation. And we've started then to see ourselves as a separate self, as opposed to when we're born and we're completely fusional with our caretakers, especially with the mother, because, well, we come out of her body. So there's that fusion is very strong, which is why the paternal figure, the other caretaker, is very, very important in the development of the separate self for the child. Because when we come into that part, that's when we then start to learn that, well, it's when the little boy wants to marry his mother, and the little girl is in love with her father. And then the the same-sex parent actually comes in and makes the child understand that, no, mommy is not for you, mommy's for me. And you will one day find a girl in your own generation. And so we start to integrate that. All right, and that's what would be in psychoanalysis or psychotherapy in itself, the normal way of developing, okay? So if you've been through that, that's good, okay? Because that's also how we then start to relate to the world the way that other people sees it, which is the difference a little bit in a certain way we can make between people who develop then mental illnesses that we would put in the category of psychosis. And so it's better to have experienced that feeling, even if it's left us very traumatized, and it still is. It's better to have gone through that because it would be the normal perception of the world afterwards, okay? Now, as we've come into that, so that's then when we start to develop the sense of I, and that's when the terrible truths come in. Or as I was telling some of you yesterday, in my country, in Sweden, we call it the age of spite. It's when we basically want to be against everything, because it also is very exciting that we start to say no, and we can see the reaction from other people when we say no. So we start to develop a willpower, all right? And then the very strong feeling state that comes in and kills all of that we all live with after that is shame. And shame comes in and kills us straight into our willpower and cuts us down, basically. And that's what we work on a lot, and so that's why we were working on inner child healing yesterday. Now, we make our way all the way up to the heart center. So, in the chakra system, when we come to the heart chakra, it is the fourth, and it's the middle between the three lower and the three higher. So it's what they sometimes would call like the bridge between matter and consciousness, between the inner and the outer, okay? And this is also where the biggest wounding happens, and kind of the original one, I would even say, as we are born, because this is where the first separation comes in, and which is actually separation. And when I say grieving the original wound, that's actually what I'm talking about. It's separation. I will explain it further. So, let's say that this is then at the time of the child's development when we start school, like properly start school, not like kindergarten and but properly start school, and we start actually to have kind of some pressure on us because we get like homework and stuff already, and then there will be this like evaluating us on what we're doing. And very much, of course, we start to develop relationships with other people outside of the caretakers. So outside of, for instance, what would be a family, whatever that might look like, all right? And so it's when we start to relate to our peers as well. Peers, sorry. P-E-E-R. So the other children. And so one thing that's really important to remember here is that we, as a child, I will begin to understand what the world looks like through the first world that I'm in. So that means the closest people to me. Let's say, in a traditional sense, a mother and a father and maybe siblings, or something that looks like that, all right? This means as well that I will relate to boys and girls, depending on what I've seen in that configuration as well. It would also mean that I will relate to the opposite sex the way I can see that my parents relate to one another. And just as a little parenthesis on that one, when you think about that, that also makes you realize that this whole shaming or conflict around parents separating, for instance, early on in life for children, I think that can also be looked on in different ways. Because is it better to stay together for the children, like they've said so often, and which they said up until the time that it was even allowed to divorce, for instance, if what the children will actually register is not the healthiest way to relate between women and men? I don't know. Because there can also be a release of conflicts and tensions if parents who, for some reason, decided that it would work together separate. Now, I'm not saying that I'm like pro anything here. I'm just saying that the whole shaming that's been very much around the idea of separation of parents, maybe we should not put so much shame on it, because what's really important is actually the loving side to it. And this also means, what we see today with a very strong sense of I, as in separate oneself from others, as in not wanting to commit to relationships, for instance, to disengage, to manipulate the other person, whether it's same-sex or opposite-sex relationships, is very much linked to what we've learned in the first years of our life, looking at our parents. So it's interesting that when you see like the older generations now saying things about millennials or whatever and the way we choose to live our life, everything is a symptom of the past. We are the sum of all our past experiences. All right? And we cannot do what we have not learned. So we will repeat what we've learned as well. And I think that when it comes to the heart chakra as well, what's really important to understand is that we live since very long time under the myth of separation. That there's a difference, that we are different to the rest. All right? Just the idea of Mother Nature in itself. Why do we have, it's not a question for you to answer, because I think we somehow all have the answer, but why do we see ourselves as separate from the rest of the world, as in nature and animals and organisms in itself? We see ourselves as separate from that. It's humans and then there's nature. And in nature we include the animals, for instance, and we don't include ourselves in that. So and that is just like a given. We take that. Even just the fact of seeing what the meat industry and dairy industry looks like today just shows us that we are very capable of separating ourselves from animals. I'm not saying be vegan. That's each and one of us decision. What I'm saying in what the industry looks like is basically making this into dead things, right? The way it's treated and the way it's made into. And so we live in a world of separation. And we separate even more, of course, in between us as well. Why do we even have wars? Because we separate between race, we separate between gender, class, just the fact of having borders of countries is a separation. And it's easier to separate oneself because then I don't have to sympathize. If I'm different, I don't have to try to understand. And I think it's also a way for us to even be able to cope with what's going on in the world. Because I think we would feel so much of the pain if we would really actually relate to it, And maybe even, so unstruck means undivided, right? And that's why when we talk about the heart as the unstruck or the undivided, the feeling that we're all searching for in anything that we do, really, I want to say, is the feeling of the whole. So the opposite to that. We want to feel oneness. If I can, let me take the example of practicing meditation or yoga, any kind of spiritual practice. Or if I would also talk about a lot of the different addictions that we have to toxins, but it can also be addictions to shopping. addiction to relationship, to love in the sense of having someone else who give you their full attention, all of that is really a seeking back to a feeling that is very familiar, because when we feel it in adult life, we know it, right? So if we feel it and we know it, it means that we've already felt it at some point. And it's that feeling of non-lack. So it's the feeling of oneness, of feeling whole. And maybe even, and now I'm being more in the spiritual realm of this, maybe our very first then separation, and so this very first wound that comes in the lack is birth in itself. If we would relate to the idea of reincarnation, for instance, and that we come from somewhere and we decide to come into this world to experience the world in order to expand, then the first separation from that whole oneness thing would in that case be birth. Now I'm on a more spiritual level of things, and I'm not asking you all to agree with me on this one, but it's just like food for thought. And so imagine if our first wound is birth itself, then we are maybe here to expand, to experience all kinds of things that are the contrast to this feeling, so that we can learn and expand and grow. And that the idea of this is to become so full of experience that we can reconnect with that feeling of wholeness again. Can you all relate to the idea that we live in a world of contrast, meaning that in order to understand one thing, we need to have experienced the opposite. In order to feel good, we actually need to know what it feels like to not feel good. And that in any way, it is when we are very, very hungry that food tastes the best. Isn't that the case? And that we sometimes make ourselves wait a little bit longer for something because somewhere it makes us feel a little bit better if we really, really desire it, and then we have it. Food for thought. Oh yes, I wanted to say that one. We're going to try to do a long practice today, longer than we did the other days, because it's going to be breathing and yin, and I'm going to talk as well in it. And I really want you to just relax into it really long. So I'm not going to talk too much longer. But I wanted to give you an information. So maybe I've done, maybe not so much yesterday, but the other days I've spoken about some people who I found really inspiring, and that I gave you some names and some books and stuff like that. So one of them, of course, is this psychologist and meditation teacher in the US called Tara Brach, B-R-A-C-H. And one of her books that is very much talking about how we find strategies to try to feel whole again is called True Refuge. So it's definitely something that I would recommend if anyone is interested in more of this. But another person that is a biologist who's very interesting. It's called Bruce Lipton like the tea. And in one of his talks that I was listening to years ago, I really had a revelation when he was talking about how we function on a cellular level. And without going into details about that, everything in this world is frequency, is energy. So everything has its vibrational frequency. And basically the polarity, or the opposite that is on the frequency of love is fear. All right? So we have this idea sometimes that the opposite to love is hate, and actually not really. I would more say that hate is like the shadow side to love more than the opposite to it. But the opposite to love is fear, because love is our need then for connection, togetherness, and expansion, creation, ultimately. And then fear is actually the opposite. When we fear, it is a need to separate, to isolate, to get away from, right? And we can see this then on the vibrational frequency, because they're on the same, but they're on the opposite sides to it. Anyway, as he was talking about this and explaining how the cell functions as respond to signals coming from the outside of love and fear, and then taking in that anything that we would label as stress is situated more towards the side of fear, as you can imagine. In our bodies, we then react to this by either expanding, growing in the cells, as when it's loving and kindness and beautiful and all of that, and then either actually stopping completely growth or even retraction, actually, when it comes to fear. And you know this just yourself, that when you come in a stressful situation, you block, all right? But, and this is absolutely true, we then need love in order to actually physically develop properly. And years and years ago, I think this is like, I don't remember correctly, I feel like it was in the 80s, they had found out that this, in an unfortunate way, in orphanages, actually in Eastern Europe, but also in China later on, I remember they were talking about children who were being given everything that they needed, but they were never being held and hugged and things like that. They weren't being nurtured in a love sense. They were given food and clothing and stuff like that, and they actually died. Yeah. They stopped actually developing. They stayed very small and actually died. So I think it's an interesting notion to just keep with us, that we have this tendency to feel like it's a gooey thing, talking about love and like, yada, yada. But actually, it is really essential to our survival. Human touch is extremely important. I mentioned this, I can't remember which one of the workshops, I think it was maybe the first one. There is a reason that when we're scared, as a reflex, we reach for someone's hand, for instance. We take someone's hand, we're holding someone. Because actually, it calms our nervous system down. That's quite beautiful. We're flock people. We need each other. And I think that when it comes to love, and so this idea of wholeness and oneness, unfortunately, what we've turned this into is a little bit its opposite. So we have a tendency to either go in the direction, which is the most common one, that it is something external to us, ideally different, another person, that will make us feel whole. All right? So when we fall in love, we feel that wholeness. There's also a whole kind of reason why we choose to fall in love with a specific person. It's also a possibility to evolve on an emotional level, because we recognize wounds in the other person that we have ourselves. But that's for another day. It's a very interesting, the whole mirroring that happens in a relationship, the reason that we're so attracted to someone and we can't really say why. And it's that feeling, when you fall in love and oh my God, and we finish each other's sentences and he or she understands me, and it's all of that. That feeling of oneness is exactly what we're looking for. But the thing is, it cannot actually last if we're not feeling it on the inside of ourselves, detached from the other person. So what happens usually is that once that very arousal kind of sensation relaxes down a little bit, because it puts us on a very high energy, so we can't really keep that. And anyway, we're human, so we can't be perfect, which means that there will be moments in that relationship where we will let the other one down. And so what happens is that then I don't feel that good anymore. And so because you made me feel good, if I don't feel that good anymore, it's your fault. So then you're to blame, and you're supposed to make me feel happy, right? And this is where, unfortunately, we go into this very dependent relationship to one another. And this is not what I talk about when I say that we need human touch and that we're flock people. That's actually not really what I'm talking about. And that's where we kind of get it wrong. And so if the other person isn't giving it to us, it's probably because it's the wrong person, right? It's not the right one. And so then we separate, and then we try to find other ways to deal with it. We start drinking or smoking or I don't know what, to make us feel a little bit better again. And then there's the other side to it. Then when we start to go into like this, okay, I'm going to feel whole again, so I'm starting to develop a spiritual practice instead. And then we come into a little bit of an opposite to that, where it's this, I need to feel whole on my own. that turns almost into I don't need other people. And it's not really that either, you see, because it's easy to be Buddha on a mountain, to sit there and you find the feeling of feeling whole, you're feeling good, you're having positive focus, and you're sending love out to the world, right? But then, when it becomes a little bit ugly, it's much more difficult to hold on to that good feeling sensation. So it's actually this balance that is the true work that we need to do. So it's the fact of, yes, that feeling of feeling good, you're responsible actually for the way you feel. I mentioned this yesterday. Emotions are chemical reactions in our brain. Other people trigger them, yes, but it's actually happening within you, okay? So if I can, on my side, work on what I need in order to feel good, and whatever it is that I take into this, and there's the having a regular practice of some kind to make yourself feel physically just feeling good, and it's also taking off time from other things that you concentrate for you, and have a journaling practice is really good as well, because you start to realize the way your thoughts go, and it makes it easier for you then to start to noticing when my thoughts keep going in that direction, or I keep having a lot of negative thinking, for instance, which is not reality. It's the state of your mind at that time, all right? So if you can have that kind of work for yourself, and then in there I need other people to survive. I want to have relationships with other people. That's how I expand. That's when someone comes in and mirror me. That is really when we're coming to what is really it is to love then in that case, or what I would call unconditional love. Now, here's where that comes also really difficult, because actually in a certain way we could call that unconditional loving is really what being completely enlightened would be, right? And so then, as we are on a spiritual practice path, we want to be righteous and we want to be unconditionally loving, and this is where what we would call spiritual bypassing comes in a lot. Because let's just face it, not one of us here is capable of all of the time being unconditionally loving, because we haven't experienced it ourselves. Our parents did not love us unconditionally because they weren't loved unconditionally, all right? And so it's all of that is being mirrored then when I'm starting to relate to another person. And the fact that I'm attracted to that person is very much linked to everything that I've been through in life, and what my mother looked like, and what my father looked like, and what my siblings were like will definitely play in the way that I choose the people that I want to have around me. And that's not just romantic love. It's the friends that I choose to have as well. And it's everything that I choose to go towards. We talk about free will. And yes, but at the same time I want to say, is there really such thing as free will? In the sense that everything that you choose comes from, you don't choose it for nothing. And you probably don't really know why you choose it, because it's so deep down. Okay. Have I got any questions? Well, this is a thymus gland. But I would even go into saying that it's the whole cardiovascular system. In the sense that this is the organs that makes us be alive, right? And so the rib cage is keeping them safe. And it's very much linked to the heart, in the sense that the heart is the center of the blood circulation as well. But yes, but if we would look at the way they would relate one gland to one chakra, it would be the thymus gland. Yeah. So we are going to start our practice in just a couple of minutes. What I want to say with all of this is that no wonder that we find it so hard to accept ourselves the way we are, because we weren't actually accepted the way we are. Unfortunately, we were told probably that we were accepted the way we are, but we weren't. Because just the fact of responding to our behaviors by just simply withdrawing love from us, as the parent would shut down or turn their attention away from them, means unconditional love. Why do we enjoy having pets so much? Because actually pets, dogs, I wouldn't really say cats because they've got their own way of loving, I guess. But I think dogs are probably a very good way to illustrate this. They will always love you. You go away, you leave them, you forget to feed them, you leave them for far too long inside, they will still jump around and dance when you come back home. So this is why we enjoy being around pets so much and dogs and such, right? And also, why do we feel sometimes that we just want to be alone? You know, we can't be with other people right now because we cannot allow ourselves to be completely authentic with other people. That's why. But somehow, it doesn't matter if the dog is around. We can allow ourselves to just be quiet and not do anything with the dog around because it's not going to judge us. So no wonder we come into this person that we are as adults, trying to find this feeling of self-love. And we don't even know what self-love means. And as I say sometimes, I prefer to maybe use the word than self-acceptance. And that's my own personal thing, because I know that even, no, not today, but some years back, it's definitely not in a very self-loving place, I would cringe to the idea of self-love. So I just prefer to use the self-acceptance word. But it's the same thing, really. And it comes into this idea of integrating oneself as something whole. I mentioned this yesterday as we were practicing the inner child healing, and it really relates to very much what we do today. It's the fact that everything that was labeled as negative, not accepted, not lovable, we were taught very early on to separate ourselves from. So this idea of the separation comes in very much here. That means that we don't want to be with ourselves when we're not feeling good. All right? This is why we then try to find something to distract ourselves with when we're not feeling good. We punish ourselves in our practice in order to put our body in the shape that we feel it needs to have for us to be able to accept it, to love it, to be with it. And this is how our yogic practice can absolutely become a poison. I was listening to this, oh my God. Yeah, if you're interested in it, write that name down. John Churchill. Churchill like the... Yeah, like Winston, but not Winston. But also English. I was listening to a talk that he's a psychologist and meditation teacher. And he was talking about actually what meditation is, and that you need to fall in love with meditation in order to actually continue doing it. Because falling in love means basically just taking it in as oneself. To love is to take as fully as yourself, which is why if you love, you cannot kill, you cannot separate from, you cannot mistreat, you cannot abuse. Remember, I was mentioning the narcissist yesterday. The narcissist is not someone who has a very strong sense of I. On the contrary, they have a lack of that. And so they need to separate themselves from the other person in order to push them down. They are not capable of loving. So in the situation that they're in when they're doing this, I'm not saying that they're never capable of doing it. So he was saying, anyway, John Churchill, he said, it's probably not him who said it the first time, but that's where I heard it. He said, yoga is a poison. Taken the right way, or in the right amount, if you will, it is medicine and will heal you. Taken the wrong way, it will kill you. And I thought that was really good because, yeah, very often, and now I'm talking about yoga because obviously this is yoga psychology and we're in a yoga place and all of that, but it goes for any kind of physical practice that we have actually. Why do we do it? Why do we practice? I know myself, I've had moments where I go to practice even though I'm not at all in shape for practicing. And I end up hurting myself and we get injuries and all this kind of stuff that happens to us because we're using it as a way to kind of whip ourselves into shape, because we can't stand being with ourselves in an image that doesn't correspond to what we've had as an image of what we should be like in order to be loved. You know, I'm not telling you something that you don't know, looking into the fashion industry and just like Instagram today, I guess. And all the apps to, oh my God, this thing called Facetune or something. I didn't know about it, where you actually take a photo of yourself and then you can kind of like fade out and change things and make your lips look, I mean, photoshopping basically. And then you put that on Instagram and it's like hashtag I woke up this way. And then how does that trigger something in me, the person looking at it? Oh, well, I don't look like that when I wake up. And so then I don't want to be with myself. But it also comes down to when I feel angry, when I feel frustrated, when I feel sad, I don't want to be with myself when I'm like that, because I was taught from the beginning that I wasn't supposed to be that way. I mean, just the relationship that we have to food. When I'm a child and I'm sad or I'm angry or frustrated and I'm giving a cookie or an ice cream to make myself feel better, not only does that mean that I'm rejecting the feeling state that I'm in, which is perfectly allowed to have, but I'm rejecting it and I'm numbing it with food, and usually something sweet. So later on in life, I develop an addiction to that, and then I develop a self-hating feeling to myself because I keep eating that, and I know that that's not good for me. And I mean, it's just this vicious circle, or cycle, sorry. Anyway, so what do we do with that? Good luck. No, so, because all of this is within us, and as I said, you are the sum of all your past experiences, but the deep beliefs that we have of this, the wounds and all of that, is not always in the conscious part. It's not something that we think about. It's very much stuck somewhere in the body, all right? And our shared willpower is something that's very conscious. So just by using willpower, it can be very hard to actually work on the things that goes deeper down. A good way to work on this is to allow for the subconscious mind to come to the surface. Now, this is what we do in hypnotherapy, for instance, when we put someone into a very, very, very relaxed state, and then we have them talking, and all of a sudden it pops up that, my third grade teacher did this to me, or whatever. Oh my God, that's where that feeling comes from. It's much easier to work on something if we know the root cause of it, all right? So the more we get to know ourselves, the easier it becomes as well to see ourselves a little bit from the outside and to be like, oh, okay, now I'm being 5 years old again. And actually, the feeling I'm in is that, but it comes from there, and it's not really maybe necessary in this moment. So that is why we're going to do a very relaxed and kind of opening practice to it. And as I said, you're the sum of all your past experiences, and in a certain way, we can even say, some people say that it's the body that is the subconscious mind. Since everything is stored within us, but the body doesn't forget about it, the mind can choose to forget about it, but the body can't. This is why, for instance, I was mentioning earlier that we find parts of the body that become numb, like the hips. The hips is a very typical thing because it's linked to desire and sexuality and a lot of those kind of things that we wanted to very much push away at some stage. But it's also the case, of course, of these wounding situations linked to the heart. And so therefore we're going to focus on kind of like releasing tensions all around the neck and the shoulders and the chest area. And as we do that, we're going to start with some pranayama breathing exercises to kind of put ourselves as well in a little bit more of an open state and a little bit more of taking the defense just a tiny bit down. Now, don't fool yourself. Obviously, it's not going to be like that and wow, everything that I've tried to defend is just disappearing, okay? But it's a practice, okay? And it's also something that maybe you can take with you and try yourself. And then after we've done some of this breathing, we're then going to come into a nice and soft kind of opening yin practice, more very much linked to that part of the body. I'm going to put on some nice music that's going to be the music of the heart chakra. And then I'm going to do like a little bit of talking. I'm going to say some loving things. And as you're in this, because it allows for you to be a little bit more open to the words, just because you put yourself like a little bit putting the defenses down and you hear it. And hopefully it will have some kind of nice and nurturing effect to it. Tara Brach, that I was mentioning earlier, she has this technique that I find really beautiful that's called RAIN. It means recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. So that means that you recognize the feeling coming, You allow for it to be. You don't reject it like we've been taught to do so much. You investigate, which does not mean actually, oh, I'm starting to analyze. It actually means to embody it, which is why it's good then to do this yin practice. You let it come in and you're like, okay, where in the body am I feeling this? Ooh, is it like a knot in the heart? Is it a sinking sensation in the belly? And then we nurture it. Nurture it is a little bit that inner child healing that we did yesterday. It's basically let it be, bring it what it needs. What does it need right now? How can I nurture this? How can I allow this to be with me and be like, it's okay. I'm here with you now. So I'll be repeating that one as well that I've done on all workshop. I am completely here with you now. How does that sound? Good? Beautiful. All right. So let's just start sitting. Sitting